debate. IntelligenceSquared.com.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming and braving the rain tonight. We're really pleased to see you all here. My name is Alana Weston, and I'm Creative Director at Selfridges. The event tonight is the third in a series of 4 discussions that Selfridges are staging in collaboration with Intelligence Squared, the live events organization, as part of Project Ocean at Selfridges. Our goal, alongside our partners, the Zoological Society of London, is to take the issue of overfishing to a wider audience, to raise money for the establishment of marine protected areas, and to give people a chance to make a difference by voting with their forks and deciding to stop eating endangered fish. As you will have seen as you've walked around the store, Selfridges is throwing everything in its creative arsenal behind this issue. From our windows to our t-shirts, from our chefs to art pieces, the message is clear. We need to protect the ocean and its creatures for future generations. Our talks series with Intelligence Squared is intended to explore the issues in more detail with an impressive lineup of activists, business people, and scientists. In week 1, Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall and others discussed the problem of overfishing and discard. And last week, we discussed one of the solutions to that problem, marine protected areas. Next Thursday, we end the series with a special storytelling event in which 4 very different ocean-going explorers will relate their tales of passion and adventure on the seas. The focus of our discussion tonight is going to be the consumer and what we should or shouldn't be doing if we're concerned about the threats facing our seas. Chairing our very distinguished panel is Camilla Cavendish, who is chief leader writer and columnist on The Times. Before entering journalism, she was chief executive of the South Bank Employers Group, a joint venture to regenerate the South Bank of the Thames, and she's won 2 high-profile awards for her campaigning journalism. Please welcome Camilla Cavendish.
Thank you. I don't know how early most of you got here, but it's quite appropriate that some of us are quite wet. I don't know if you noticed how much it's raining outside. It's a good thing when we're discussing fish. Tonight, as Alana said, we're going to look at the consumer, something I'm very interested in. You know, should we be eating fish at all? And if so, which ones? And the little guide that Selfridges produced is absolutely fabulous, I think, but it does show quite how complicated the issue is. I'm not quite sure I'm going to remember it unless I take it with me to the restaurant. Let me just introduce the panel and then we'll get going. Over here we have Caroline Bennett, who is the founder and managing director of Moshi Moshi, which most of you will know, this great sushi bar. She's won so many awards that I just can't actually read them all out, but basically she has been very actively involved in marine conservation, I think in a number of ways, and you've been involved in a fisheries project called Invest in Fish. Next to her we have Henry Dimbleby, who is the co-founder with Allegra McEvedy of the Lyon restaurants, and some of you may have been to their first restaurant on Carnaby Street, not very far from here. His chain was founded on the twin principles that food can both taste good and do you good. And he's a board member of the Sustainable Restaurant Association. Then we have, we have Nick. We're supposed to have Nick on my left, managing director and co-founder of the Scottish salmon farming company, Loch Duart. Is that right? I never get it right. I eat it and I can never pronounce it. But you'll do that for us. And they were the first salmon farm in the world to achieve the Freedom Food approval. And last but not least, we have a Spaniard, which is a bit worrying when we're talking about overfishing. But you can tell us more about that. Aniol Esteban, who is head of environmental economics at the New Economics Foundation. And I think you were an economist at the RSPB before, so you've moved from birds to fish, which isn't quite an interesting move. I'm going to ask each person to speak for about 4 minutes. I'm going to be quite ruthless so we can open up for some discussion from all of you. So Caroline, maybe you'd like to go first.
Is that working? Yes. Well, firstly, thank you very much to Alana for inviting me to be here. I think it's an extraordinary personal commitment on her part to make this all happen. My journey with fish started in 1998. We opened the first conveyor belt sushi restaurant in Britain in 1994, and we'd been happily using bluefin tuna for the first 4 years of it. And then one summer, I came into the restaurant and berated the chefs for there being no bluefin on the menu. And they said, well, we did order it, but there's just the suppliers say there's none available. So I ended up phoning the suppliers, and sure enough, they're saying, well, we keep placing the order and there's just none there. And I eventually got on to Greenpeace, who put me through to a phenomenal person on the oceans, Carl Safina, who was based in America. And I had this slightly surreal conversation. It was very late early in the morning for me, I think, and late for him, one of the other way around. But he was sitting there on the phone saying to me, Caroline, eating bluefin tuna is akin to eating a rhinoceros, and you wouldn't have that on your menu now, would you? And I was just sitting there thinking, yeah, I guess the Japanese do eat quite a lot of bluefin. So, Carl, where else can I get it from? And there was this sort of big pregnant pause. And finally the penny dropped for me. And I think it just sort of highlights really the extraordinary disconnect 15-odd years ago between the consumer and the NGOs at that stage. And I'd certainly never spoken to an NGO about the problem. I wasn't aware of it, and he seemed not to have spoken to many restaurateurs either. So I was then invited to sit on a project that was sponsored by the government, by DEFRA at the time, to link fishermen with NGOs, and it was Marks and Spencer's were leading the retail side, I was leading the restaurant, plenty of NGOs led by WWF. And after 5 years of deliberation, we really came down to the really menial conclusions to present to government as to how the fisheries should be managed, which to me was a real shame that we had these extraordinary brains, these extraordinary capacity amongst the group to come up with some radical solutions, and we just didn't do it. And I suppose that was the point where, to me, top-down approaches, because of the complexity of the common fisheries, I just felt I wasn't in a position to tackle. So a colleague of mine, a scientist, we decided to tackle it bottom up, and we did this because I truly believe that in 2050 there probably, we will hit the wall. There probably won't be any fish left in the sea unless we do something about it. And the only way that we could see we could make a difference was to start doing small-scale things. So we go out around the British Isles and we try and link small-scale fishermen who are doing the right thing in the fisheries, and we link those fishermen directly with the restaurants. And that is really the only way that you can truly understand how your fish was caught and where your fish was caught. Otherwise, as a consumer, it's blooming difficult. So I think just to wrap up, I look at the last 15 years and I think, well, what has changed, actually? I feel like it's been an awful long time and an awful long investment of time. And I think what has changed is the consumer awareness. For sure, the likes of this extraordinary event have helped with that. Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall's extraordinary fish fight series is now perhaps pushing that more into the political arena, where for sure they've known about the problems, but to hell they've had anything that they wanted to say or do about them. And I think now with the political will behind, or rather with the consumer's will behind it, possibly we might have reached that tipping point. And it would be really great to think that that tipping point will tip us in the direction that we can avoid this 2050 disaster scenario where the fish stocks will be depleted and gone. And we can head to a future where we can all be enjoying fish at reasonable prices. And as Charles Clover put so incredibly simply and eloquently in his film End of the Line a couple of years ago, he said, we don't need any more information here. We know what to do. We don't even really need much money. We know what to invest in. All we need is the will. All we need to do is do it. And I think that's where we are now.
Thank you, Caroline. Just one question. I don't know if anyone else wants to ask Caroline questions, but at the moment. But how aware do you think your consumers are? How many of the people who actually come in and eat at your restaurant are remotely bothered about this?
Well, we had when people join to become members, one of the questions is our policy influencing you in any way, shape, or form? And compared to 6 years ago, where maybe 15% of people said yes, that's right over 50% now. So in the last 2 to 3 years, absolutely more people stated as one of the reasons why they choose to come to the restaurant. So, yeah, a really big improvement.
Anyone else want to come in? Or should we move on? Henry.
I'm speaking as someone who, until relatively recently, was incredibly ignorant about fish and remain pretty ignorant about fish. But I run a chain of restaurants who has a stated principle that we'll only buy from sustainable shoals, and therefore I know quite a lot about the difficulty of trying to guarantee that that's the case. I think from a kind of consumer point of view, there are probably 4 things that I'd take away from the experience that we've had over the last 2 years. The first is that it's incredibly complicated. It's more complicated than you could possibly imagine, and I'll come to that in a second. The second is that no system will ever be perfect. So no rating system, no MCS, MSC, none of them will ever get it right all the time. And we can't use that as an excuse not to do anything. And the third thing is I think it's far too complicated for the consumer to deal with on their own. And some of you here will be the exceptions to that rule. But for most people, the only way to make anything happen is to ask up. So to make sure that every time you buy fish, you ask the question, and believe me, businesses care. They will then take the effort to make the change. But it's too complicated. This book is wonderful. But I mean, the number of people who are actually going to go and do it for themselves every time they go to the fish market, it would be embarrassing for a start. So complexity. Yeah. So complexity, there are kind of 3 kinds of complexity that we came across. One I call adjectival complexity or process complexity. Diver caught scallops was the thing that really opened my eyes to this. I love the idea of diver caught scallops. And whenever we put an adjective in front of something, it makes it feel kind of wonderful. And I was talking to a friend of mine, a guy called Mitch Tonks, who's a wonderful fish chef, and I was saying, we've got to get diver caught scallops. And he said, Henry, you realise that it's not environmentalists who dive for these scallops. It's capitalists who dive for these scallops. And they get more money depending on how much they can pick up. And actually a group of divers on a rocky bed can completely clean out the bed, both large scallops and smaller scallops that will go on to grow and become bigger. And down in Brixham, where we were fishing at the time, it's actually better to dredge because you leave the small scallops behind because the dredger bumps over the rocks. So there's a kind of adjectival thing, which is process, line caught, diver caught. It's not always right. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not right. The second kind of complexity was species complexity. We were in a world about 5 years ago, where cod was bad and sea bass was bad and mackerel was good. And now, again, as you look in here, this is actually even simplified. So this gives you species by the sea, but actually fish are a lot of species are much more local than that. It's fish by the specific area, and you can have even areas as small as a half a mile where there'll be quite a good population of certain species. So you have this species complexity. And then the final thing you have is temporal complexity, i.e. it changes over time. So stocks that were bad can become good, and stocks that were good can become bad. And if you look, for example, at the moment at the Icelandic and Barents Seas, potentially because of global warming, but their temperature's up a couple of degrees on what it has been for a while, and the stocks of cod there are the biggest they've been since the Second World War. It's absolutely it's a cod fest. And therefore, if you get a certification, you're never going to be able to keep up with all of those things. The certification will always be imperfect. People will always be saying we can eat some things which we shouldn't be eating, and that we shouldn't be eating some things which we can eat. But what kind of the implication of this for me, for the consumer, is don't weigh yourself down with it. Don't feel, if we all feel as consumers that we have to have that amount of knowledge, then we'll never get anywhere. But do ask. So if it's too embarrassing to ask in person, send an email. Literally, send an email to the restaurants. Ask them if they're a member of the Sustainable Restaurant Association. Ask them what kind of fish they use. Alison from the Sustainable Restaurant Association, who's here, did a lot of work for us, and we were trying to source a sustainable fish finger. And it was a living hell. We got sent documentation that kind of was this big pile on a table, and I couldn't make head or tail of it, but she went through it meticulously, which you're never going to be able to do. She went through it meticulously and said, yeah, I think it's okay. So my kind of main message was, as consumers, yes, take on the responsibility if you've got not much else to do. But if you've got other things to do, like most people do, just ask. Always ask. Restaurant ask, fishmonger ask, send the email if it's too embarrassing in person, but ask. And then I really do believe that the industry itself and the business itself will sort themselves out, but only if you ask all the time.
So the point is to embarrass them without embarrassing yourself.
It's very difficult.
Anyone want to come in on that?
I would like to briefly add that maybe one of the implications of this complexity would be as well to be more cautious and support the precautionary approach about when you manage these complex systems that depend on time and space. So I see that as another implication maybe to what you were saying.
Yeah, there's an example of that, I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it the orange roughy, which they suddenly started digging out of the sea in the north of England, and these wonderful new fish, and they were delicious, lovely texture, and then they worked out, they suddenly quite quickly, they started falling off, the quantity of them. They worked out they were all about 50 years old and had been sitting on this ridge for 50 years, which was a bit too low for the old technology to fish. And as soon as the new technology came in, their populations were destroyed. And that's kind of an example of where caution probably would have been a better approach.
Nick.
Hi, I'm a salmon farmer, and I'm here representing a different community. I think when we talk about these sort of things, I think we divorce ourselves from the people who actually do it. Well, I'm one of the ones that does. And that's quite important. I've been doing it for 30 years, which also, I should point out, is the life of the salmon industry. We're not a very old industry, and we've made a lot of very bad mistakes. But I want to talk about a couple of issues which bug me particularly, and as those who know me that I get bugged quite a lot by things. That's why I was involved in creating the company I created, which was to try and answer some of the issues. And the first one is, we waste from households 8.3 million tons of food a year. That's from households. That's not from restaurants. That's not from supermarkets. That's not the byproducts from factories. And if you fed that to ragworms, and you converted those ragworms into meal, you could feed the entire world salmon industry 1 million tons of protein. It's quite a scary one when you think that we don't value food very much. When we talk about, as Caroline said, reasonable priced food, do we value that food if we're throwing away that much? And if we want to solve the issues of the sea, we're going to have to solve the issues the way we eat and the way we waste things. The constituency I represent is often not discussed. They are people on the west coast of Scotland. The west coast of Scotland has been denuded of its indigenous people as primary production becomes less and less popular. And it came home to me in a Seafood Choices meeting in Seattle in 2003 when we'd had a day and a half of discussions about sustainability. And I was sitting on a panel with a guy from Unilever and a guy from Carrefour, the French supermarket chain. And the guy stood up at the front of the audience and he said, look, I get sustainability. It's not very complicated. I'm a fisherman. You want me to catch less fish. He said, but I have a wife, I have children, just the same as you do. I have the same bills you do. So it's not very complicated. Do you want me to catch less fish? Will you pay more? He directed it to the guy from Unilever. And this was the shock to me. The guy didn't even give a preamble. He just leant forward to the microphone and said no. But the real shock was the guy from Carrefour, who wasn't even asked the question, leant across to the microphone and said, we won't either. Now, in a scenario like that, where we have so little understanding of the people who actually do the job, and we're quite happy to ask them what we wouldn't ask ourselves to do, will you do more work for less? Will your children suffer because of the greater good? No, I'm afraid I'm for expensive food. I'm for expensive fish. I'm for the value of fish rising. I'm for the value of food rising. Because if we don't value food, then we aren't going to survive as a species. And if we increase the price of food, then perhaps we'll value it enough not to throw it away. Thank you.
Wow. The obvious response to that is that, of course, food represents a very high proportion of bills for people who don't have much money. How do you deal with that?
I would love to answer that one because I was once attacked on the basis that my view of food was patronizing, that having high quality, wholesome food at a high price was a bad thing. Well, my corresponding argument is that at the moment there are two sorts of food. One is high quality, high value for the rich, and one is poor quality and low quality for the poor. And what we seem to think is that quantity is the game. That it's okay for poor people to have enough food that's not the quality. I think there should be one quality of food only. And I'm afraid the sad news is that means that poor people will eat less, but at least it'll be wholesome and good for them, which the current food we are producing is often not.
Anyone else want to come in on that, Caroline?
Can I just make the point that I was probably badly putting it, but that if we hit the wall in 2050 with there being so few fish, that's when the price of fish will become so exorbitant. And that's why I was saying if we want to eat fish at reasonable prices, we have to act now. I are totally behind you believing that food should be priced as representing the cost it takes on the earth.
Right, we'll probably come back to that in questions afterwards. Aniol.
Thanks very much. I'm in the business of driving change towards an economy and a society that operates within environmental limits and it's socially just. And within that, we are doing work at the New Economics Foundation together with other NGOs in the UK and the Ocean 2012 Coalition, which brings together more than 120 organizations in Europe trying to get the common fisheries policy, this piece of legislation, right so that we get good management of fish stocks. And as you can tell from my accent and as I was introduced, I'm coming from Spain, which is a fish predator nation, and which has the biggest fleet in Europe. So it's a big challenge for me to talk about sustainable fisheries in the UK. And every time I have to say something about it, I have to provide a justification. And this justification, or in my defense, I have to say that I come from Barcelona, from the Mediterranean. So I claim my Catalan nationality there. And the Mediterranean Catalan fleet doesn't interact with the British fleet, so there is no conflict there. Maybe some conflict with football, but that's not a topic. That's not a topic for today. I'm here today to talk to you about, as consumers, what can we do? And I don't have very good news on that front, because the main message that I want to get here today is that if we want to keep eating fish for many years and to restore fish stocks, we're going to have to reduce our level of fish consumption. And that doesn't mean cutting off fish from your diet completely, but certainly reducing it until fish stocks recover. And that's very simple. A fish stock properly managed can produce a long-term flow of benefits, revenues, and fish. But if you overexploit it, it gives you much less. At the moment, in the European Union, about 72% of fish stocks are producing less than what they could produce. But at the same time, we are increasing fish consumption. How are we filling this gap? We are filling this gap fishing farther abroad, importing more fish, and also through aquaculture. At the moment in the European Union, 1 out of every 2 fish comes from outside EU waters. In Spain, Portugal, Germany, Italy, it's 2 out of every 3 fish that comes outside EU waters. In the UK, it's more or less like in the EU. So if in the European Union had to, if all the European Union citizens had to consume their own fish resources, at the current levels of fish consumption, we would only last until the 2nd of July. This is 1 week earlier than last year. So there has been a trend moving forward. In the UK, if the UK had to consume only fish caught in the EU waters by the UK fleet, and including fish produced through aquaculture, the UK would last until the 16th of July. That's 3 weeks earlier than last year. So there is an increasing dependence on fish from abroad. And that means more trade. I'm not against trade as long as trade takes place within environmental limits and it's done in a socially just way. But the problem is that all of us in the world, global population and global fish consumption has hit a record high, as the FAO reported this year. So it's not that we can take it from somewhere else, it's that everyone else is eating more fish and the stocks cannot take it. So the message is that we need to eat less fish. And at the moment, some of the solutions that we are hearing is that we should eat more certified fish or eat more variety of fish. These are solutions that have their place, but we should not forget that the priority is to restore the fish stock. In particular, when we hear that let's diversify the amount of fish that you can eat. Well, Spain eats 3 times more species than the UK, and it's not an example of sustainable fisheries management. So don't let the UK turn into a fish predator nation as well. Another point I would like to make is that one of the biggest problems we face, and this links to what you just said, one of the biggest problems we face in trying to solve this issue is that we live in an economy that makes it very difficult to do the right thing. If you're a consumer and you want to buy the good choice, it costs you more money. If you're a business and you want to do the right thing, you're going to get less revenue and put your business more at risk. If you're a decision maker, a politician, and you want to take bold action to restore fish stocks, possibly you're not going to be in your post for more than a month or 2 months. So the whole context makes it very difficult to do the right thing. And unless we don't change the rules of the game, it's going to be very difficult. Here in the panel we have examples of some initiatives that, in spite of this adverse context, are succeeding. But let's not forget, it's a minority. A powerful minority because you can inspire other people. But unless we don't change the rules of the game, this minority will remain minority. But if we change them and create a context where success is aligned with doing the right thing, then we will have a better chance to turn this minority into the norm. So eat less fish, change the rules, and support Barcelona on Saturday.
Right, I'm going to throw it open to questions. There are people wandering around with mics. It's very hard to see, so if I don't see you, you might want to wave at me or stand up. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yeah. No. We can hear you, though.
I'll speak loudly. Okay. Thank you. Oh, there you go. I'm Paul Williams from Seafish. We're a government agency that works in the UK to help the industry towards sustainability. I think we're putting, in some of what's said, we're putting too much faith in the consumer. And there's lots of work done on this, some by Seafish, some by other agencies. If you ask any consumer, do they care about sustainability issues, they will give you a very, very big, solid yes. If you look at what they do in the supermarkets, where most of them buy their fish, they will buy on price. And I think that Nick has made a really important point in that the driver against sustainability in the UK is that food is too cheap, and that's really driven by the big retailers. What are the panel's suggestions for how we can actually get out of that loop and get people to recognise the value of the food that they buy?
Nick, do you want to start?
If I had the answer to that, I mean, the cynical side of me can say things like, well, the truth is my company wouldn't be a success if our fish didn't taste different. That's the truth. It wouldn't matter how good the initiatives we put in place are. People won't pay more unless the meal's better. So perhaps that's the beginning. Perhaps we have to start working on types of farming that can make better food and lift that and raise that. But the system works against it. The whole food system works against you. I got to be careful because I have customers and I might be found in a back street with a knife in my back. No, that's not true. None of them would ever do that. But the fact of the matter is that the wholesale system in this country for food predicates against quality and predicates breaking ranks. The same thing occurs, I'm afraid, in the supermarkets. We've been very lucky in that we've dealt with a lot of people, sadly, a large proportion of them outside this country, who've been willing to brand us and actually say that this is the producer. But we haven't just got to value food, we've got to value the people who produce them. There are some really scary things going on. If you look at what's happening in the countryside, the average age of a farmer now is in the mid-50s. Fishermen are the same. But also there's less and less of them. So the knowledge held, inherent knowledge of the place that these people do their work, is getting less and less. So we're forcing people into corporate food. You get larger and larger farms run by corporations. You get larger and larger fishing boats run by corporations. Don't be surprised if the quality of your food goes down.
Okay, I'm going to ask Henry to come and answer that question as well.
I think it's part of an even larger question. Now, when you talk about fish in the UK, of course, what fish we eat is going to make no difference if the Japanese and Chinese carry on eating enormous quantities. And if you raise that question kind of to a higher level, an even bigger issue at the moment is the amount of protein that we're all eating, the amount of meat we're all eating. It's taking up a lot of grain. It's putting pressure on prices of commodities in countries where the food basket is 80% plus of weekly salaries. And we're back to we may be back to a situation, kind of the Irish potato famine, where the English are doing nothing because they can't see everyone else dying outside of their borders. And that will be what happens with meat if the current trends carry on. So the question then is, what do you do? What do you do about anything like this? I will continue to buy meat if I kind of hadn't got involved in what I'm doing and saw a broader picture. I wouldn't really be aware of this. So I would continue to buy meat as a consumer. You're never going to get the consumer to change. But the reason I think things like this are important is because I believe, and I wrote a blog about this for The Telegraph and got the most incredible vitriol thrown back at me, but I believe that it will need to be legislative. So I cannot see how the problem of the rich in the world eating the poor into starvation can be resolved without concerted political effort. And political effort happens when politicians see the consumer, see people caring about things. And therefore, while in the end it's probably, in my view, pretty futile, you avoiding eating a sea bass from an area, it'll make no difference at all tomorrow. The fact that as a movement people are coming together and making this a more acceptable level of political discourse, hopefully in the end will drive global change. But I think it will, sadly, and the Telegraph hated me for saying it, but I think it'll be a legislative thing rather than a consumer-driven thing in the long term.
Caroline, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was sort of touching on both those points. I think a lot of this is driven by scale. And if I look at sort of my restaurants as a sort of microcosm of that, if we say, well, we're going to sell 30 portions of that dish, we might be in danger of saying, well, we want therefore 30 bass or 30 mackerel. But if we say, we'll have 30 of whatever the fisherman pulled out of the sea that day, it doesn't matter what he pulled out, we'll use them. They'll just be cooked in the same way and served in the same way. And this guarantees the consumer the quality that Nick alluded to. And if all fish are taken from the sea and used and paid a fair price for, so you're not getting line-caught mackerel on a sunny day landed in Cornwall and getting 5p a kilo just because the trawlers have landed 2 tons on the same day and they're also going to get 5p a kilo. If you're differentiating, if you're able to make that differentiation through the power of your pocket, then I think slowly things will move on. And I think very differently in Spain, but in Britain, if you see a special of the day on the fish board or on anything actually, you sort of tend to go, ooh, chef's ordered too much of that. That's one to avoid. And I think if you can turn this on the head and start to be more confident in special of the day, there's only 3 portions of it, it's damn good, it was caught yesterday, and it's run out now, sorry, we'll have to wait for the fisherman to catch some more, then slowly the fisherman will start to get this connection more with the end consumer, and the price will start to feed through that way.
Thank you. Aniol?
Yeah, very briefly. I think that the problem is that we are masking the price of this product. And we are masking it because it's very easy to understand. When a resource goes down, the price goes up. This is what has happened with fish, but price has gone up very, very little. And we are masking it through maybe imports, which we control because there is a bit of asymmetry of power on how trade happens sometimes. And we also subsidize the fishing industry in a way that is allowed to continue in what would be a very financially unviable system. So if you remove those things, prices would go up. But I also think it's a problem of unrealistic expectations that we all now need to eat fish lots of times a week, otherwise your health is going to suffer. Is that, yeah, it's fantastic to eat fish, we love it, I love it. and we wanted to keep eating it. It's healthy, but you can eat less fish and nothing happens to you. And it's the same, like, if you fly, it seems that there is a right now, as a consumer, to fly cheaply every weekend on wherever we want, to Prague or wherever we want. And that's also another example that doesn't reflect the real cost of that consumption.
I was going to ask that question, actually. I mean, are we all eating more fish? I mean, I've become obsessed with omega-3, and, you know, we keep reading articles. We all in the media, we endlessly write these articles about fish oils and meat is bad for you. I mean, has that produced a reaction? Are people eating far more fish? Sorry? Are people eating much more fish because they think it's healthier? Yes.
I mean, if we look at the levels of fish consumption from the FAO for the European Union and for the world, the average fish consumption per capita goes up, and the projection in the European Union is that the consumption of fish is going to continue going up. In the UK, has been quite stable. In Spain, has been quite stable. It was interesting after this January fish Channel 4 season, fish sales went up, and that initiative had lots and lots of positive things, and I support it, and it's fantastic. But if we're going to increase the volume of fish sold, then maybe we are shooting ourselves on the food.
So Selfridges' campaign will produce more fish eating. Would you like to ask a question?
I was out to dinner the other night with a friend from Barcelona, and I was in the restaurant, and I said, I'll have some cod. And then we looked through the menu, and I said, is it sustainable? And they said, yes, of course. And then I pulled out the little fish guide, and I said, actually, the area where this is caught is not sustainable. And so we had a little bit of activism. My friend from Barcelona said that was fun and all, but in Barcelona, this would never fly. So my question is, you know, in countries like Barcelona or China, for example, is this really possible to get the sustainability agenda on the table? And if so, what is the time horizon that we're looking at?
I think it's possible, and there are increasingly movements in that direction. The third sector, it's much smaller and less professional than in the UK. So there's lots of work to do that in that front. But I think that one of the shortcuts, rather than creating a strong third sector, which was going to take lots of years and so on, because we need to act quickly. One of the shortcuts is that Spain feels the pressure from other countries. At the moment, Spain has kind of been dictating what the fisheries policy in Europe should be. And they have got very little pressure from their citizens, who sometimes see Spanish fleet as a sign of pride without having a clue of all the impacts that this has on not only in Europe but on the whole world. That is not out there. That needs to get out there. I think that a few articles in the different broad and very influential media in the UK or in Germany or in France would possibly touch a nerve with some people, and that I see that as one option. We can talk later, and I can give you other ideas.
Great, lady over there. Would you like to?
Hi, my name is Natalie. I work in sustainability communications. That's my profession, and I'm quite interested to know the panel's opinion on what you think about the power of behaviour change science, because there are a certain amount of people in the population who'll be swayed and persuaded by education, by, you know, reading an article in the press, and then they'll make an informed decision when they go to a restaurant. But there are other people who might be more influenced by seeing what other people are doing. So what I wonder is if the concept of social proof, i.e. the copycat effect, you know, it's, for example, if you take plastic bags, you know, the use of plastic bags has hugely decreased in the mainstream consumer, you know, sort of arena, and supermarkets are producing far less plastic bags now, and it's become because it's all, you know, originally I used to always refuse plastic bags and go blush and go red because it was a really embarrassing thing to ask. And then suddenly now it's totally socially acceptable to do so, and almost every cashier now says, oh, would you like a plastic bag? And it's completely changed because it's now become socially acceptable to do so. So I'm wondering if social proof could be a solution.
Nick, what do you think?
Well, I think the plastic bag's a very good argument, but it's a comparatively simple one for someone to understand. What Henry said is true, that it's so complex, this area. It's so difficult. I'm less cynical. I have hope. There's a company in America that has concentrated on the methods of fishing that is selling into all the restaurants and branding the individual fish into restaurants based on the fishing method and the sustainability of the operation. And one of the things that we traditionally haven't done is use the marketplace as a place to campaign. I mean, we talk about ourselves as a campaigning company. We don't just think of ourselves as a salmon farm. We think we have a message to send out, that there are better ways we can grow food. So I think we can use the market as a major educating tool. We need that with a very good educational background. Now, they use evangelists, which they send out all over the States. And it's a really impressive job they've done, because the evangelists aren't allowed to sell. They're only allowed to talk about the actual values of each product they sell. And it's worked extremely well, and it's worked in the same way as with the paper bags. It's worked with restaurants, where one chef has got it in their restaurant, and the next chef, 2 restaurants down, notices and wants to be involved. And there is a very positive movement. Now, I stress it's on the 2 coasts of America, which is where it's easier to do. But it does show that we can actually change things, and I would give up tomorrow if I thought that we couldn't. It's pretty hard doing what we do. I have guys out who risk their lives most days, and I was rescued by the Coast Guard 2 weeks ago, so it's quite hard what we do. If I didn't think that there was a reasonable chance that we were going to change things, I wouldn't be doing it.
The 2 of you are both running restaurants, so you have some idea of how people actually behave. Have you managed to change people's behaviour on anything, not just eating fish? And if so, how did you do it?
Well, I think it's part of this connection issue, because if you stop seeing food as a commodity and you start seeing food as a valuable resource of the earth, and something that obviously we all need, then you start treating it with an immeasurably different outlook, and respect just follows on from that. So if you have a fillet of fish in front of you that's caught from an illegally landed nondescript trawl off the coast of Africa, or line caught by Bob in Helford, I think that starts to make the difference. And that might sound like greenwashing, it might sound a bit cynical possibly, just trying to sort of boost the individual, but I think making that connection with somebody, you say, well, I don't mind giving Bob an extra 50p, £1, £1.50, whatever it might be, and I think it's that connection that actually eventually will make the consumer feel joyful for making that change.
Henry?
I don't know. I think that the theory behind this behavioural science is a kind of evolutionary point of view that, from an evolutionary perspective, following the people in the village who beat up more Romans or are good at growing cabbages is good for society. And now, unfortunately, celebrities have become those people, so we all subconsciously buy the bags. And the problem with it, as I think you were saying, is the complexity. I do think because I believe very strongly about the kind of the power of celebrity, and that we have to accept that people, even subconsciously, follow celebrities because they are the strongest men in the village or the most fecund woman, and that we should harness that. I think at our level, it's kidding ourselves to think that we're going to change the society in such a major way. But what I think we can do is begin to, we call it sharing the knowledge, but educate a certain portion of people who will then talk to the celebrities or whoever it is, and that, again, we're starting a political movement. But I think that that's very different from seeing Angelina Jolie walking around with an MSc or MCS, depending on which particular body for bag, which I think would make a big difference and be a big part of it, but it's quite a complicated message.
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because, all the retailers in this room are trying to sell more products. And most environmental issues, in the end, require convincing people to buy less. And as Nick said, you can square the circle by raising the price, but it is a very, very tricky challenge, isn't it, for all of you? Because ultimately, you can try and select the product, but if Aniol is right, and we actually all need to be eating half as much fish, you've got quite a problem there, because you're, you can't sustain a business, right?
Well, I was interested in, from an economist's point of view, you talk about the price not being reflecting the true cost. What mechanism do we have to make that happen? Is that a legislative thing, or how do we make the price reflect the true cost?
Can I just put a word in there? Look, we always think this is terribly complicated, isn't it? If you look at my farm and look at what we do, we fallow for a year. Other farms fallow for 6 weeks. We fallow for a year because we think that's crucially important. But the cost of doing that is in our food. You have to pay for it if you want to buy our fish. We will only buy fish meal for our feeds from certain sources, and we started the big push to look for where you buy your fish meal and to try and make sure that the fisheries are well fished. That costs more. So that's bringing an inherent environmental cost into the cost of food.
Aniol?
Yeah, I think that partly answers the question, and also it's, as I said earlier, if you have a fictitious situation where an industry is acting and can solve things cheaper than what they would really be because you are subsidizing it, so if you change the way those subsidies work or remove them or create a transition process, that would change the price. You can also pass legislation to show that certain impacts have a cost, and then the challenge is to find ways, realistic ways to enforce them. You can look at the carbon cost, whether that's an option that can be integrated, or you can, I mean, there are different ways, there are many different ways of internalizing these costs that at the moment we are not seeing. Fuel is subsidized for airlines, but it's not for other industries. It is subsidized for fishing vessels and so on.
It's subsidised hugely for fishing. I mean, they don't pay any tax on it at all, do they? So when 2 years ago the oil price went up, that was the point where we were actually thinking, well, this might actually work. Trawlers are going to go out of business here. And it was purely because the oil price was going up, where for the rest of us it wasn't making that much difference. Can I just make one? Yeah. It's a statistic I heard from an extraordinary woman called Vandana Shiva. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with her, but she's an Indian physicist by background, but has moved into organic farming. And she came up with this extraordinary statistic a couple of weeks back, and I Googled it just to kind of make sure I'd got it. And it said the US has $400 billion a year of subsidies, farm subsidies. That's $1 billion a day. And that's an externality that is just not fact. I mean, of course, fishing, grain producers, meat producers, nobody can compete on a level playing field with subsidies at that level. It's quite extraordinary. So I think that sort of level of economics is so beyond the scale of a small restaurateur, which is why I choose to go bottom up rather than try and look at it top down.
Yeah, there is a big problem in the US, isn't it? Which is the farm subsidy always gets tacked on to any bill that's unpopular. But another question over here.
Yeah, I was just, it's interesting listening to this. I spent 3 years as a meat trader, trading everything, not fish, but beef, pork, poultry. And my biggest market was China, where I shipped a couple million kilos a month of offal chicken feet, that kind of thing. And it's all about cheap protein. I mean, that's what it was about. So when people talk here about, the cost of food needs to be higher, the reality is it's not going to be. I mean, you've got your shipping costs. Most of the cost was added the last mile. So, we would ship a lot of cheap protein, but it's the wholesaler, the retailer, or the restaurant that actually added most of the cost to the food. And so I guess my question is, combining that with all these subsidies and the other competing things, is there any chance really that anything but well-directed public policy is going to change this? Because there are too many competing interests otherwise. Does anyone here think the consumer can actually change it, except get their politicians to put in public policy?
I'll ask Nick to answer that.
Okay, the standard answer to all of this is regulation. Let's give you an idea of how my business runs. I employ about 100 people. They're all over Scotland, in some of the remotest parts of Scotland. And when they go to sea in the morning, they break into groups of 3. I can't tell you what they're doing. I have to trust them. I have to teach them the right way to go and ask them to do the right thing. If you think regulation is going to make them do it, you're wrong. Unless you want to put an inspector with every single team. So here's your fundamental problem. We want to do it right. Regulation is not the answer. I have a beef and sheep farm in the Orkneys. We have 200 sheep, 200 ewes, on an uninhabited island. And our government has said all lambs must be tagged to their mother. Will you imagine going onto an island, gathering all the sheep, and trying to figure out which lamb comes from which ewe? They don't go to mummy. So regulation is not going to solve this problem.
That's not public policy. I'm talking about the precautionary principle. No more, in Canada, they said no more cod fishing, period, off the coast. That's what I mean by public policy, not by regulation on baseline.
If you mean stopping one set of fishing over another, what tends to happen with fishing is that if you say one species is bad, then those guys that are out there fishing, the difference is you've got to split it up. Caroline's right. You've got to split it up into the small guys and the big guys. I know that's terribly touchy-feely, but it's true. You really have to, because the small guy has to know their local area. And they don't have a huge overhead, which means that they've got to bring in 600 tons. If they don't bring in 600 tons, it doesn't pay for the boat. So the problem is, while that capacity is out there, if you block one fishery, they go and fish another. We can't keep moving from species to species to species to species and saying, this one's bad, so this one's okay now, so we'll fish this one out. At some point, we have to have an overall view. And I'm afraid to say it does come back to price. I do believe, I'm afraid, that the only way is for food to get more expensive. And we're talking about, in this country, food not being a very high percentage of our earnings. There are plenty of countries who have much, much higher.
Are you talking about, do we need to talk about price, or are we talking about a moratorium? Because you're sort of suggesting a moratorium, aren't you? I mean, I suppose you could, it's politically impossible, but you could say, could try and argue that you need just a 2-year freeze.
I mean, raising price is more regulatory than a moratorium.
Well, it's more complicated.
You can't just, well, the market takes care of itself. You're always going to find ways around it. The fisheries come in, do 30 million salmon in a week, the price drops, right? You can't regulate that.
Aniol, do you want to comment on that?
No, I just always think that the consumer, we always talk about what the consumer can do, expecting the consumer to be the main driving force. And it's undeniable that the consumer has amazing power, and that needs to be, we need to make the most of it, because it has impact on the way the production system works. But wouldn't it be nice that we as consumers go into a supermarket and know that we can buy whatever fish or product we want in peace of mind, knowing that that has kind of been following? Shouldn't that be the situation where we find ourselves, rather than, so shouldn't there be some kind of choice editing? And that is called regulation. And I take your point that regulation, you cannot regulate everything, and you need to be doing it in a clever way and in a smart way. But you need to find the right balance. And sometimes we need to make the most of the consumer, but let's not forget that by changing the framework within the consumer operates, you will get much better results and outcomes.
Another question over here.
Hi, my name's Sean. I'm currently at Green Alliance. I'm also working on behaviour change. And I'm not sure if anyone saw, like Client Earth, just saying what an appalling job supermarkets do of informing their customers. When I did my MSc, it was on sustainability labelling, and I was told by everyone that I interviewed from sectors that choice editing is the way that we go. And I know I try and base my decisions sometimes on the MSc system, which isn't perfect, and also the information you get from the MCS. But my thought is, what do you think of, it's a partial system of information, whereas if you were to label every single product, then at least you've got, and I know the Food Standards Agency is pretty weak when it comes to, even enforcing nutritional information, and they sort of caved into the demands of the big retailers on that. But what do you think about a blanket system of labelling? Do you think that has any merit? And do you think that the MSc labelling system actually might be counterproductive in that it sends a certain signal and there's an absence of signals from the unlabelled fishes?
Just a point on that. You're making me think about the 5 a day, because it seems to me that there's a sort of theme running through here, which is we need to eat less fish. I mean, Aniol, you made that point very strong. We are eating more. In fact, you've all said that in different ways. We probably need to eat better fish, but we need to eat less fish. And in terms of behaviour change, I mean, I think the 5 a day, that government's 5 a day campaign has been quite successful, hasn't it? I mean, people now seem to have, certainly my children have this in their head. You know, they don't necessarily want to eat vegetables, but they sort of know they have to eat 5 a day. And a lot of products now contain, you know, products that contribute to your 5 a day kind of make that point, don't they? So I wonder if that, I mean, I wonder if you can get some kind of campaign that says, you know, 2 fish a week or whatever. They did that for pregnant women, do you remember? I mean, you said, you know, when you're pregnant, you're told you mustn't eat any tuna, which is kind of slightly strange. There is one? Ah, well, tell us what it is, and why don't we know about it? What is its message?
The government's message on fish is you should eat 2 portions of fish a week, one of which should be oily fish. It's a message, though, that comes from the Food Standards Agency based on health advice.
Right.
And on sustainability, they kind of just take the stance of pushing it over towards, I think, MCS on their website. So they say you should try and eat fish twice a week, one of which should be oily. If you're worried about sustainability issues, look at these websites, and I think it's MSC and MCS.
Right.
I think the whole issue of eat less fish, population rising to 70 billion by 2050, big portion of the world starving already, likely to grow. I think, you know, we can take perhaps we take a slightly smug stance that we're not going to be that portion of the world, but in fact we're already being outbid. I was talking pretty recently to a very experienced prawn buyer who was saying that Russia now will pay more for unpeeled prawns than he could afford to pay for peeled. We're already seeing, I think it was Henry talked about the big stocks of cod there are at the minute in the Barents. A lot of those going now into China and Russia rather than into the UK because, again, we can't bid on those prices. Those populations are growing. None of this is, that all sounds very pessimistic, which possibly I am. But I do think the complexities of how these, and Aniol would understand far better than me, of how these markets work and how they're going to develop, to simply say that we should eat less fish, I don't see where the drivers for that are going to come from on an international level.
Anybody else want to respond to the point here about behaviour?
Well, there's one sort of point over the other side, actually, on maybe marine protected areas is an obvious solution to just stop fishing. You know, that seems to have been proved to be very successful. I think I personally would like to see the debate move away from the discussion about which species to eat and look more at maybe labelling on how a fish was caught, because if you can imagine a completely Disneyland scenario whereby every fish that's eaten is only caught by line and pole, how quickly that would change the oceans. I mean, over a couple of months it would change the oceans. So you'd have a lot of much wealthier fishermen. We'd probably be eating much better fish, much bigger fish. We'd probably be paying a bit more for them. But so for me, it's the how it was caught is perhaps more important than the what is it. I think that's just
very interesting. Important. Nick?
Well, when people talk about eating less, they come back to what we're throwing away. There are 2 parts. I'm sorry, I'm going to go a bit hippie on you here. I've been with Sam for 30 years. They've fed and clothed me. They've fed and clothed my children. So the first thing is we've got to have a little more respect for the things we eat. And I mean that in a real sense, that we're eating another animal. We grow a lot of animals to eat, and we have very little respect for them. Some of the stories are the way that we kill animals and the way we treat them, and then we chuck it in the bin. There's a horrible disjoint there. And when we talk about our style of farming, respect is something we use all the time. But when you talk about eating less, you don't have to eat less fish per week. You can have it 5 times a week just to eat a smaller portion. We don't need the size of portions we eat. They're far too big. And effectively, I've always said about our fish, we were 15 to 20% more expensive. Just have a 15 to 20% smaller portion. Trust me, it won't do you any harm.
This comes back to the point you made earlier about behaviour change. There was I don't know if you ever read the experiment by Robert Cialdini when he put bowls of soup around a table and got a very good discussion going between some students. And unbeknownst to them, each bowl of soup had a tube underneath which was replenishing the soup from the bottom. And they just kept eating it. And it's back to that idea that, the larger the plate you have, the more you will eat it. As human beings, we have an extraordinary capacity to just go on consuming whatever we're offered. So maybe we need to offer people smaller portions. That would be good stuff. Aniol.
Yes, we would like to say that, yes, global markets are very complex, and we need to take into account what's happening in China and Japan and in the world. And precisely because population is growing, we have a bigger problem. Therefore, a bigger case for us to reduce. So if the game is to have fish there for many years, we all need to make an effort, like in the same way that we need to make an effort in reduce carbon emissions to avoid catastrophic climate change. And sometimes you hear that the UK shouldn't do anything because China is going to do much more emissions than us. So, well, if they outbid us on some aspects, but we might still want to behave responsible on what we do. I think that the numbers from official sources show that at least through a few years until we restore fish stocks, it would be good that we eat less fish until these are restored.
Gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Ewan Dunn. I work for the RSPB. I wanted to ask a question about discards, and it's very likely in the Common Fisheries Policy Reform, unless something very big happens between now and July, that there's going to be a requirement for all fish caught to be landed across a wide range of species. I was thinking about this when I was in Seattle last year, because I was on a factory trawler, and the bycatch there gets fed into this. The target catch is very valuable for the crew, but the bycatch gets fed into the social welfare system in Seattle. So the poor get the bycatch, which is an interesting concept. But so it could be that in the foreseeable future, not too far away, we're going to finish up with a heck of a lot of fish being landed in UK ports. And I just wanted to ask the panel what they think should happen to it and what the market implications of that might be.
Nick?
Yeah, I could go at that one. We have a policy inside our company, which is that we fund our critics. So we find people who are interested in looking at what we do and criticizing us so we learn better. I'm for it funding a policing system. I think that's the simplest way, because by God, that's a disincentive to catch it.
Anyone else? Caroline?
I think there's plenty of things that fishermen just aren't doing yet because they haven't had to, because they can hide behind this issue of, it's the EU legislation that's enforcing me to discard. They could fit an awful lot of very simple things. I mean, escape panels, square mesh panels on the back of these big trawls. They're not expensive at all. I mean, I've heard they're under £1,000. So actually, very, very, very easily, you could change that quite quickly. So there's less excuse, I think, than perhaps the fishermen are being given credence for.
Does anyone have an answer to this specific question, though, of what do we do if we end up with a lot more fish landing in ports?
I mean, presumably it's a job for the branding agencies. I've recently seen people trying to rebrand Coley, rebrand all sorts of fish that are otherwise unattractive. My guess is that a lot of this stuff is delicious, and some of it we can feed to his salmon, and the stuff that we can eat, we should get the Saatchis on it to make it more attractive. Monkfish, for example, since they started taking the heads off in fishmongers, sales of monkfish have gone up a lot. So, I mean, there are always things you can do.
Is there a question over there? Sorry, I can't see very well on this one. Do you want to just use the microphone because people can't hear?
It was a question on subsidies because everybody keeps getting discouraged about what the consumer can do, and yet if it seems to me that most of the subsidies aren't for small fishermen, they're for large ocean-going trawlers. And if you were to just stop those subsidies, you would make an enormous difference to the price of fish being landed and allow smaller fishermen to stand a chance. And I'm just curious, I would think that this would be a really great area to focus. I'd love to know more about how and who I speak to stop it from happening.
Can I just ask the gentleman from Seafish, do you have an answer to that question? Sorry to land that on you, but I just wondered if you had a view.
If we look at the European Union, the subsidies are traded as part of CFP policy. So again, I mean, talking very recently to some of the people who remain nameless within DG Mayor, one of the issues you have to understand in developing changes in the CFP, a lot of the countries within Europe use CFP and quota trading not simply as a question of controlling fish, but they can use it to trade against political changes they want to see in agriculture, or indeed something that's nothing at all to do with food production. Yeah. The subsidy system that comes in, again, in Europe, largely comes through the EU. It has moved more towards sustainability issues, but in quite a weak way. How do you get that changed? I guess it's the kind of thing that we keep coming back to. It's about putting pressure on politicians to look at a different system. How easy that is to do, again, when what you need to do is you need to line up a lot of countries behind the change. So you need to get the message out around Europe.
Nick, would it make a big difference to your business if those subsidies disappeared?
Nope.
But would it benefit your business? Are you getting any subsidies at the moment?
No. No, we don't get any subsidy. Would it make a difference? I suppose it'd be interesting to see if there was a more realistic price for fish. I mean, we come back to what Aniol says. If the real environmental cost of those fish was in those fish, then perhaps salmon would look, and particularly our type of salmon, the cost of that would look more reasonable. Therefore, I suppose it would encourage our market.
Question over there.
Given what everyone's been saying, I mean, is the answer to look at tax? I mean, we regulate the consumption of petrol and alcohol and cigarettes, which are either precious or dangerous in their consumption. Could we not do the same with fish, and perhaps specifically target how tax fish in how they are caught? So if they're caught in a system which is not sustainable, that they're taxed, so tax trawlers.
Caroline, what do you think of that? Would that fit with your idea about...
I'm not sure I'm really sufficiently knowledgeable to comment on it, but as a layman, from what I've heard from the anecdotal stuff about trawlers a couple of years ago when the petrol prices were going up, I would completely agree with that. That
Henry?
seems to be like a very easy thing to do.
As I've said, I think that legislation is the only answer. I think the idea of taxing fish by how they were caught sounds complicated. We obviously do a lot of VAT, and in restaurants, if you serve hot food, it's deemed that you've added value, but if you serve cold food, takeout, you haven't added value. So there are endless debates about things like whether crispy fried duck is actually meant to be eaten hot or is just hot as part of the process that goes into making it. And if it's the latter, you don't pay VAT on it. And I can see that a lot of barristers would make a lot of money, as they do on VAT law at the moment, if you brought that in. But I do think legislation's the right thing. I'm just not sure that particular
Aniol,
idea
as our
would fly.
economist, do you want to answer the tax question?
I think tax would be one route, but I think you already would achieve most of what you want by setting the right amount that needs to be caught, and by directing subsidies and allocation of fishing rights or the privilege to fish to those that fish in ways that benefit most society. And at the moment, that's not the way we are using our public funds and the public resource, which is the fish. If you allocate those to the type of fishing that will create more value to society in economic, social, and environmental terms, then you set the right target, you're already doing enough, and you might not even need to go to the...
Gentleman over here in the red tie. You get a microphone.
I'm interested in aquaculture, and it seems that, well, I understand that the rate of increase in global aquaculture output is increasing at something like 10% a year, I think I've read. And it seems that that sort of isn't really looked at as part of this argument. So assuming that rate continues, and it can continue in a sustainable fashion, and I know there's lots of issues surrounding that, is that not a part of the solution to this problem?
Nick, you're the aquaculture man.
Gosh, not a simple one to answer. Yes and no, I suppose. Yes, it's the answer if it's done right, and if we start to use things that we're not using now. I suppose I've got an internal debate in my company at the moment about what sort of things we can use in a salmon diet. And here we hit some of the consumer perceptions which are somewhat confused. It's apparently perfectly awful to feed meat to a cow, but it's perfectly acceptable to feed vegetables to fish. I'm trying to work that one out. I still don't really get it. In salmon diets, there's a higher and higher proportion of vegetable. Surprise, surprise, you don't get a lot of taste out of the fish. But the question is, on what basis should we grow? We're criticized as an industry, and justly, that we use a finite resource. We happen to use it more efficiently than any other industry, but that's not the point. It's a finite resource. So how do you deal with that if you're growing? Do you dilute it with something else? Is it okay to feed chicken waste? Let's take chicken oil, which actually is a byproduct which is very similar to fish oil and a lot of its properties. Is it okay to feed that to salmon? I don't know. I think it's one of the questions we've got to ask, because we've got to do something with all the wastes we create. We can't just keep dumping them.
I think I'm beginning to get put off eating, actually, on this conversation. We're going to have to wrap up quite soon. Are there any more questions? Any last questions? Yes, gentleman here. Just take a mic here.
To what extent do the panel feel that ongoing intellectual debate actually sustains consumption at the expense of action?
Sorry, can you going into?
Do you mean we should stop talking and get out and do something?
Yeah, I think it's a dichotomy, isn't there? Really. So it's really about dichotomy, because clearly, let's not be naive. There are vested interests here in terms of consumption, and whilst I'm not involved in, say, the fish-related aspects of sustainability, but certainly in terms of global warming, one of the strategies adopted by some of the primary polluters of carbon dioxide is to engage in this seemingly inclusive debate, in the knowledge that by seeming to be inclusive and open to debate, under the covers they can carry on business as usual. And is that actually happening in terms of sustainability and the fisheries, etc.?
Can I say that? I think that the question is, of course, there are all sorts of vested interests, and there is all sorts of in all these debates, there are people who are doing it for the wrong reasons, people who are trying to filibuster, slow things down. The question is, at what level do you stop the debate? Because my belief in this area is you can't take direct action. We can't all march out somewhere and stop eating fish, and the fish are going to survive. We actually need to get the political wheels rolling, and in order to do that, you have to have debates which are sometimes fatuous, or sometimes boring, which sometimes have people who have complete vested interests. But if you've got a better solution, I'd like to hear it. Because I think it's very, very difficult to get anything done without debate. I'd love to march. If you can show me where, I'll follow you. And we'll march together. I'll be behind you all the way.
Got any suggestions? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm naive as to this debate, but am I right or wrong in thinking that the Rothschild associated with this debate is part of the Rothschild family?
Okay, we'll have to come back to that. Maybe come back to that after.
Because Nathaniel Rothschild is known as King Cole. And so, at a monthly event called Green Mondays, one of the people who's most prominent is somebody who's employed by Nathaniel Rothschild.
Oh, well, that's a bigger environmental issue, which we can come back to afterwards.
Are you saying global warming wouldn't affect the fish?
You're talking about Nat Rothschild?
Yeah.
Right.
Can I say one? There's quite an interesting, because I think I have some sympathy with that point of view, and I often debate whether people doing things for the wrong reasons is a bad thing. There is a couple who've set up a restaurant in London trying to reduce carbon off-print, and they have all of their footprint, carbon footprint, and campaign for that, and all of their money comes from fertilizers, which is directly leading to some of the use of carbon. And you have a number of questions there. One is, are they doing it just to salve their consciences personally? Are they doing it because they think in some way it'll let them get away with the bad that they're doing elsewhere? And I think you can only answer it case by case, which is, I don't care if someone's doing something because they feel guilty. If they're doing something good, then that's good news, you know. So I think it depends on a case by case basis. But I certainly wouldn't attack. I don't know whether Rothschild's involved in anything or not. But just the idea that someone who's doing something bad can't also be involved in doing something good.
Oh, somebody who you know, as a family, achieve huge financial gains by investing in coal and carbon dioxide and global warming. Also sponsor somebody who attends a green event to greenwash themselves, because they then play up and PR the fact that they're investing in green projects.
I'm fascinated by that, because Nat Rothschild does not have an environmental
Intelligence Squared
image.
get funded by the Rothschild family in any way, shape or form. Is there 100% disclosure of financing of Intelligence Squared? I can answer that question is no. Thank you. That's all I was looking for.
Right. I must say, Nat Rothschild would be the last person I would ever expect to even attempt to cover himself in green clothing, but maybe. But we will not put up with that if he does. Was there one more question over there? Yeah, and then that'll be the last one, I think.
Thanks. Forgive me if I missed the answer to this, but when we say let's eat less fish, does anyone know how much less? When the government says we should have 2 fish a week, from a sustainability perspective in the UK or even beyond the UK, how many fish should we be eating?
Aniol, did you make that point earlier? You did make a point about it.
No, but it's a good question. I mean, it's not. There's not a clear. You could look at how much fish should be eaten to see how much would it take to restore fish stocks, and compare that to the amount of fish being eaten nowadays, and see how much should be reduced. We haven't done that work, but it should be done. However, I am aware that this is possibly the last chance we have to say something. So I just wanted to end on a positive note, because one of the problems of NGOs or talking about these things is that we get lots of doom and gloom and it's terrible and so on. And yes, the problems are serious, but we are going to solve them. We're gonna get them fixed. We humans have a clever brain, and we'll make it happen. And one of the key things is to send some positive messages. On the last week of the Ocean Project, it coincides with the European Fish Week. It's from the 4th to the 12th of June, and the Ocean 2012 Coalition is actually doing this European Fish Week under the theme of let's go back to the future. Things look very good in the past, and we can go back to restore fish stocks and have them as healthy as we used to have them. And linked to that, we're going to have an exhibition, photo exhibition at the zoo in the aquarium on this theme. And well, I hope that once Ocean Project has finished, you have something else to look forward to.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a very good note to end on. I have to say, personally, having been worried about fish, but knowing almost nothing about fish, I've been quite heartened to see, just literally from the bios of the people on the panel, how many extraordinary organisations, award schemes, there already are. So I think it is possible that we are at a tipping point, and it is possible that people like me in the media need to get a bit wiser about this and start talking about it. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you very much to our excellent panel.